thank you, Mr. Avramopoulos and Mr. Panzeri, for your very cogent and lucid opening comments for this short webinar on fighting impunity in the 21st century. I'd just like to say that the whole concept of fighting impunity might seem to some people to be a very large one, a very vague one even. There's no doubt, I'm sure everybody in this world would agree that to fight impunity, especially as regards violations of human rights or economic rights or corruption, is an imperative. It's one thing to wholeheartedly agree that this should be done, but then it's quite another to try and figure out how practically it could be done, how to overcome entrenched habits, systems, and other invisible obstacles to the fight against true impunity in this on this planet. And it's my honor to be able to chair this opening session, this opening panel, and I would like to first of all to welcome the Greek Minister of the Interior, Makis Voridis, who I'm sure by virtue of his position in the Greek government would have quite a bit to say. Mr. Voridis, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. To tell you the truth, I find quite accurate your introductory comment, in the sense that ever since when I was at that time young law student in the law school, in the Athens Law School, and we're being taught about international organizations and their role. You know, there was in our discussion at that time, there was an upcoming constantly question, which was, okay, all the purposes and the good motives and the good intentions that they are declared by the international organization, that's fine. But could they accomplish anything with that? Are they of any use? Because at the end of the day, the sovereigns remain the national states, and the national states would not possibly, they would not like to uphold those principles or implement those principles. So all these discussions about the international organization and international world order, international jurisdiction, is it any useful at all, or is it just theory? Now, after all these years in politics, I must say that indeed I am convinced that there is a very practical and specific role for the international organizations, especially those who defend human rights and who are trying to establish an international jurisdiction to prosecute such kind of crimes or gross violations of human rights. And one has to be honest, from that time, which is 30 years ago, until today, a lot of things have been carried out and a lot of things have been achieved. That doesn't mean to say that we have accomplished everything, or that there are not a lot of things that remains to be done. But indeed, I think in pursuing this track, which means in trying to establish an international order which will protect human rights and will prosecute the violators of those human rights that are protected, I think that we are on the right track. Now, when I was serving as president of the ad hoc committee for counterterrorism in OSCE-PA, the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, we were dealing a lot about, criminal regimes and terrorist regimes and what can be done. At that context, I have the opportunity, to study on different resolutions from UN, and actually a framework which most countries, most national jurisdictions have said that they will adopt. So one important thing is that since most states accept those UN resolutions, in my view, this does create an environment for a kind of international law which is based on multilateral treaties and agreement, but which at the end of the day are enforced, if they they are adopted as they should, they can be enforced at the legislative level and at the administrative level in national states. I found that an interesting tactic, because there the states have already said that they will accept these resolutions, and then it's very important to have the civil society plus the parliamentary assemblies and the parliamentarians to push for this kind of adoption of this legislative framework, which will work as, let's say, a kind of international legislation which will permit a more secure world if these things are implemented. Now, I do understand, and I want to praise that the work that you are carrying in fighting impunity. I think one of the key messages that one should address to international leaders wherever they are, is that at a certain point, especially if they act in a completely, let's say, illegal but immoral way, and they violate international legal obligations, especially those concerning humanitarian laws and the protection of human rights. At the end of the day, at a certain point, after less or more difficulties, they will face justice, they will be prosecuted. And I think if they know that, this is something that they seriously take into the decisions. Now, in the Greek Ministry of the Interior, we are dealing with public administration. And one of the things that I am strongly convinced of is that public administrations all over the world are crucial in serving the purpose of upholding the international obligations of the countries, plus of creating a culture of integrity into the administrative system. And the culture of integrity and transparency are very important for allowing the monitoring of the exercise of power by the administrations. And so this monitoring also creates a frame where no one is, let's say, free to do whatever they think, so they should consider all the possible implication of the infringement of these laws that we are talking now. So embedding a culture of integrity and transparency into administration, into public administration, is a key role of our work. In Greece, we have adopted a law of internal control, which actually puts checks and balances into public administration. Also, we have legislated an institution we call a Council for Integrity, where mostly employees, where they see something happening into public administration, they can address this council and ask that an action to be taken so that they can fix this problem. And of course, now we are passing a law for lobbying. I know lobbying is much more than for business interests, but I think it's quite important to keep a balance between economic priorities and moral priorities in public life. So yes, there is work to be done in the interior of public administration, and I think it's very important that we have different bodies. It's great that I see that in this panel we are going to be hearing from Cecilia Rickstrom. It's very important because she's leading a head European organization dealing with public administration, and it's a great help to us, and we hope that we can deepen this relationship. So there are a lot of things to be done. Public administrations could do more. Of course, in the effort that you are undertaking in fighting impunity, you should consider the Greek government an ally of your effort. I think there are gross problems and violation of human rights all over the world. There are huge discussions to be made and difficult decisions to be taken when we're dealing with children's labor, or with the violation of women's rights, when we're dealing with forced marriages, even mutilation, when we're dealing with torture, or we are dealing with the loss of life, of human life, especially in conflict areas, when we are dealing with terrorist regimes, or with the violation of the freedom of speech. Those values, those are very important areas where our action should be internationally organized. So I wish to praise you for the work you're undertaking, and please do consider our government as an ally in your effort, and we hope that we can work more closely with you in our common goals. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Minister Voridis, for your comments. I picked out 2 points. One is that national sovereignty and the considerations of national sovereignty remain paramount in international relations, and it's the attempts to overcome sovereignty in certain areas will be resisted if a nation sees its interests are threatened. The other point is that both Minister Voridis and I have studied international law, and we know that there's no such thing as an international policeman or gendarmerie to enforce decisions which morally are generally accepted by most of the nations of the world. And I think it's important to point this out. The theoretical, not only practical, but theoretical difficulties owing to the inadequacy of some international law and the insistence, the understandable insistence on preserving national sovereignty in the face of major problems such as the fight against impunity. Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Did you ask me a question? Do I?
Yeah. Well, it was a kind of a comment, rather.
No, it's a comment, so I don't have to say something.
No, you don't. I just have to introduce the panel coming up.
Okay,
we have
great.
3 very. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for your
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Contribution. I'd like to introduce our panel. First of all, Thor Halvorsen, who is the president of the Human Rights Foundation; Cecilia Rickstrom, former member of the European Parliament, an honorary board member of the Fight Against Impunity; and Stelios Kipolopoulos, a Greek MEP of the New Democracy Party, who belongs to the Subcommittee on Human Rights. I'd first like to call on Mr. Halvorsen, who, as president of the Human Rights Foundation, I would imagine has a sound theoretical basis for what he's about to say. Mr. Halvorsen, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Carr. It's a great honor to be here. I'm really encouraged and enthusiastic about the minister's remarks, as well as Mr. Panzeri's introduction. It is inspiring to hear that there are so many people who see the world through the same eyes. The Human Rights Foundation is devoted to the struggle against dictatorship worldwide, and specifically authoritarian governments, whether they are fully authoritarian dictatorships or competitive authoritarian states. Of the 96 countries that we have identified as non-democracies, 77 of them are in the bottom half of Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. To put it differently, there is a very strong correlation between authoritarianism and high levels of corruption. The fact is that authoritarians, dictators, people inside authoritarian states are focused on the loot. They're focused on getting rich. They're focused on looting the treasury. And although there may be some limits in terms of national sovereignty, what can absolutely be done is the creation of an international mechanism to which only democracies can belong, that would target and sanction individuals who are in authoritarian countries, who are responsible for human rights violations and for corruption. Because the truth is that most human rights organizations are focused on the human rights violations and comforting the victims. And that's very important. But the other side of the human rights violations, they would not occur if it wasn't for corruptions. The fact is that the targeting of journalists, the targeting of newspapers, the silencing of media is because they are reporting on what these governments are doing. So our view at the Human Rights Foundation is that the struggle against corruption is absolutely central. And rather than sanctioning the entire state, we can engage in sanctioning the actual individuals involved, ensuring that they cannot own property, that they're not able to have property in any member state that is democracy, that they cannot facilitate financial transactions in any of those member states, or that they're not allowed to enter into those member states. So that is what we believe should occur. Now, there's already, of course, all sorts of international standards of good governance, and the United Nations, which is in and of itself a club of both dictatorships and democracies, has said the right words. That said, they haven't actually been able to define what corruption is. We believe that there should be a UN rapporteur on corruption, the establishment of a rapporteur in order to respond to individual complaints, conduct studies, to undertake visits, and to assess the relationship between corruption and human rights. We believe that one of the most effective things that is outside of what government officials can do is Magnitsky legislation. We are strong believers and proponents in the Magnitsky legislation, which was first adopted by the United States in 2012. Since then, it's been adopted in Estonia, in some form in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Lithuania, in Latvia. We believe that more member states should be doing it. We believe that the power of the Magnitsky legislation is key. The fact is, dictatorships and authoritarians could not get away with what they are doing if democracies put an end to their financial transactions. We think rather than using tanks, we should be using banks. That is our point of view. Now, I'm more than happy to enter into much more detail about imposing targeted sanctions in order to achieve foreign policy objectives. And this would mean no use of military force, no destruction, no bloodshed. The population would not suffer. The only people who would be targeted would be those engaging in human rights violations. The fact is that dictatorships, authoritarian countries have hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars parked in banks, institutions, cash reserves inside democracies. Furthermore, they require, if they're resource-rich countries, they require democracies to buy their goods. In fact, we always view that they have the leverage, when in fact, the people inside democracies are the ones that have the leverage. That's essentially our general point of view, and I'm more than happy to go into more detail. I just want to make sure I don't pass any timing constraints we have in this conference.
Interesting.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I can't hear you, Mr. Carr.
How about now?
A little better, yes.
Okay, yeah. I was impressed by this little slogan you gave out, banks, not tanks. I'm sure we could use this as a kind of catchphrase to persuade people that force is not always necessary in settling this kind of issue. Also, you mentioned that how do you define the judicial definition of impunity? We know how to define human rights violations. We know how to define corruption, but can we define impunity judicially? And I think if we can, on that hinges whether we can do something effective about it. What do you think?
Well, first let me say that I did not come up with the phrase banks, not tanks. That's our chairman, Garry Kasparov, is the one who coined that phrase, and I think it captures all of it, because ultimately people in these dictatorships don't trust their own dictatorships to hide the money. So they want to hide the money in democracies. And democracies, most of the time, are okay with that. Most of it is in real estate, because you don't have to do KYC for real estate transactions. If you want to buy a business in the United States, in the United Kingdom, there's usually KYC. You want to open a bank account, there's some KYC. You have to use foreign corporations. But if you want to buy real estate, there's no KYC. They can do all sorts of transactions. So there's a disincentive because all of these countries and all the people doing property taxes enjoy the more purchase of real estate. They don't want to kill the market by stopping Kazakh money, Russian money, Saudi money, streaming from corruption into these real estate locations. So how do I define impunity? Very simple. They commit a crime and they get away with it. It doesn't require academics. What we also should do is incentivize the struggle against corruption. We should have incentives so that rather than having a government official who is making a small amount of money as a salary, who so easily can be incentivized to look the other way. What if we incentivize the struggle against corruption the same way that tax cheats are incentivized when people can ring and say to the authorities, this person is cheating on their taxes. We can do the same exact thing with corruption. The same exact thing can be done.
So here we have, you've just given a set of suggestions, proposals about how the practicalities of this task can be met. I'd like to move on now to Cecilia Rickstrom, who is an honorary board member of the Fight Against Impunity, and I'd like to get her take on this entire issue. Go ahead, Ms. Rickstrom.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the honor of being invited to this very important and very timely event. Ya fuime stinelada y telenasas efaristos que esta evenica, un caritiria yatinor organos y afistis tefilosis, esas efaristo yatintinipu mecalesa, tora, da tunechistus tangica. So having said that in Greece, as I am in Greece at the moment, I'm just thanking you for organizing this event and for the honor of being invited to participate. It's really an honor and a privilege to be a part of this very important event. I'd like to give you a quote by David Miliband, who in his speech in the conference of the World Economic Forum in 2020 said, and I quote him, "The age of impunity is here and it is dangerous." End of quotation. So let's put ourselves the question, what is impunity in our age, even in the EU in 2021? It's the retreat from rule of law. It's the deterioration of human rights. It is a time where crimes go unpunished. It's a time where no one is made accountable. And it is a time where war zones change women's bodies into battlefields. And it is because everything goes unpunished that everything also happens. Chemical weapons, bombing of hospitals, bombing of school buses, targeting of aid workers, targeting of children. Let me be concrete for a second. I have been a politician 17 years, 7 years in the National Parliament of Sweden and 10 years in the European Parliament in Brussels. I know from deep within that politicians tend to point out what is happening in third countries far away from us. But I do believe that we cannot address what is happening in other countries and expect human rights to be defended in the EU foreign policy if they are not defended in the EU and all of its member states. And at this point, we all must act jointly. It's not only a question to NGOs or politicians. We all jointly must act together. So therefore, I today call on governments, on businesses, NGOs. We need to work together to lead the fight for human rights and thereby shape the future also on this continent, in our member states. And we must use our voices, our resources, our experiences. Let me give you some numbers. Only in 2020, 66 journalists in the world were killed. Since 1990, 2,659 journalists have been killed, according to figures from the International Federation of Journalists. I personally have taken up the fight for certain individual cases, for example, the Swedish Eritrean journalist David Isaac, who is imprisoned in Eritrea since 2001 without any trial, and nobody knows if he's dead or alive at this moment. And there are so many like him all over the world. But I have also fought for freedom of expression in the EU, which is needed more now than ever before. Only a few days ago, on the 6th of July, Peter de Vries was shut down, leaving his office as a journalist in Amsterdam. I do remember the shockwaves when Jan Kuciak, together with his girlfriend, were shot dead in Slovakia. The case of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta is still in my heart and in my mind. And a few months ago, in this very country, Yorgos Karaivas in Greece was killed while exercising his duty as a journalist. 8 out of 10 European journalists have experienced violence and threat. 8 out of 10. But as I started, impunity begins with a crackdown of rule of law. And it continues when judiciaries are politicized. We see our own member state. We see what's happening in Hungary at the moment. We see what's happening in Poland. And it continues when media are politicized, when media freedom is eroded, and it's happening at this very moment. I am not a politician anymore in the EU, where I used to chair all the committees as chair of the Conference of Committee Chairs. Therefore, I dare to say the following. I would not have dared to say only a year ago or two. When Slovenia has taken up the EU presidency only a few days ago, at the same time, journalists are threatened and they are exchanging the media freedom with pro-government narrative. This is happening in the European Union at this moment. Journalists are being fired for no reason and replaced with pro-government colleagues. You'd see, this makes me upset. All in all, Greece is now today hosting this event. Greece is my second home country that I love dearly. Greece as the cradle of democracy, of culture, and freedom of expression, a role model for the rest of the world in many respects. I believe, first and foremost, that we must have Greece an example to secure and safeguard human rights in this country, in the other EU member states, and in the European Union as such, in order to be met by respect when acting human rights in the world. Let me give you one last anecdote. When I was invited a few years ago to Bangladesh as a keynote speaker on a human rights conference, I was asked afterwards about capital punishment in relation to the creation of the EU and its member states. And then I told the story of the enlargement process by the EU when 10 additional Eastern European countries entered in 2004. And before this happened, country after country abolished death penalty in order to be established as a candidate country. So imagine when EU lead by example like this one, we could lead the rest of the world. But are we doing that today? That is a question mark. Now, let me say this. There is a lot to clean up on the European backyard before we start pointing fingers at other countries. Of course, we need to set up a whole agenda with fighting corruption, with establishing media freedom, with really everything that goes without saying that I have already addressed. But in order to talk about it, in order to enact in the foreign policies of the EU member states in third countries, we need to lead by example, and we must not shy away from that. So thank you for having listened to me. Εύχομαι σε όλους σας Όλα τα πάνε καλά και ένα καλό καλοκαίρι με ασφάλεια.
Well, thank you, Ms. Rickstrom, for your very cogent comments. You mentioned early in your speech, you cited David Miliband as saying we're in a new age of impunity. But hasn't that been the case through all human history, basically? We're still only a few decades from Hitler and Stalin. And even before that, there were even worse tyrants. Wouldn't you say that the 21st century so far has been an improvement instead of a deterioration? What's your opinion?
Of course, the 21st century has been fantastic after the Second World War, where we saw that human rights, I mean, what Eleanor Roosevelt did, or the whole charter, everything that flourished. But what we see now in recent years in our continent is a deterioration. And that is alarming. What I'm saying is that we cannot leave it all to politicians. We need to act together. We need to raise our voices, and we need to tighten the links between politics, business, NGOs, etc., so that this can finally become truth and not only a beautiful document or a summary of a conference. We have too many of those. Now we need action. Vrasitatelome.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Rickstrom. You certainly made very interesting points with figures and with genuine hard facts. I'd like now to turn to Mr. Stelios Kympouropoulos, member of the European Parliament for the New Democracy Party. And I'd like to forward a comment from the audience here. It's that impunity depends often on whistleblowers, people in the organization who see an injustice or serious crime or serious something like kind being committed, blow the whistle to the media, and actually are rewarded with something like 30% of the damages awarded the people who have been wronged by the government. Do you see anything like this happening in Europe, Mr. Kympouropoulos?
Mr. Carr, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this very timely event. It's a true honor to be among so many distinguished guests and colleagues. And we have heard from Mr. Minister Voridis and the other distinguished speakers until now the great variety of violation, unfortunately, the violation of human rights when impunity still exists. So I believe that we all agree that humanity is still faced with numerous challenges and by human rights conditions in many parts of the world. Thousands, as we have heard, are fleeing conflicts, while authoritarian leaders and non-state actors are perpetrating heinous atrocities. As you said about, and the question from our audience about what happens in the EU. Against this background, the EU should take up responsibility and make the fight against impunity a central element of our external and human rights action. This is essentially one of the ways the Commission can live up to its aspiration of being a geopolitical one. We should not forget the European continent that is a pioneering actor in the area of promotion and protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law worldwide. However, our credibility is increasingly at stake if we see what is happening in some of the member states. And we need to remember, as Europeans, our responsibility to prove our commitment not only to a rules-based international system, in theory, but also through our actions. But our efforts in the area of human rights are hampered by disjoint actions at the EU and national level. Therefore, I believe that striving for a more coherent approach between the EU and its member states is a key. From our perspective in the European Parliament, we have systematically condemned cases of human rights violations, and we will continue to do so. I believe the adoption of the EU Global Human Rights Sanctions regime is a very important step, but it should be part of a broader strategy with specific benchmarks connected to our objectives, and we should consider further expanding its scope to include also other human rights abuses. But we cannot fight impunity unless perpetrators of serious international crimes are brought to justice and held accountable by fair and effective judicial bodies. These processes, while impartial, should allow victims to participate and have their voices heard. We also need to ensure the provision of recognition and redress to victims, but also to foster trust and confidence in state institutions and thus restore the very fabric of the society. And of course, leverage on our tools at our disposal in order to strengthen the rule of law. In practical terms, we should better cooperate with our international partners. We need to continue our strong support to the International Criminal Court and other international tribunals. And finally, we must have a more strategic approach on the way you use our development aid and political tools. Starting with the international cooperation, the EU-US Transatlantic Alliance to defend democracy is very timely and should be used in order to reflect some of our objectives. In the area of international criminal justice, obviously, the International Criminal Court is a key element in the effort, always having in mind the principle of complementarity. In this regard, Biden administration decision to lift sanctions and visa restriction on ICC officials is welcome. Finally, we need to remind ourselves that the EU is among the biggest donors of development aid and humanitarian assistance. Dear colleagues and distinguished speakers, fighting impunity requires collective action. And as parliamentarian, I'm committed to do my part in order to make it happen. This is my a way of accepting to this invitation and to be part of this society, because nobody needs and has to live without justice, and everyone needs to help each other in order to feel free of acting their actions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kimperopoulos. As a member of the Subcommittee on Human Rights in the European Parliament, what would you say is the most pressing problem right now that the subcommittee has to deal with? Is there any particular problem in Europe or abroad, or are you just dealing with the general phenomenon of impunity?
I think that at this moment, the way of action that we defend human rights is one of basically ideas is to have, and everybody can understand the gap, the gender gap that exists in many states and in many third countries. So what we try to defend very obviously, not only in third countries but also in member states in European Union, is to support the gap between women and men, and on any level, and to support that we are the same on the same positions, we are the same on the same work. So I think this is one of our biggest tries to create a balance between the understanding that women and men are equal.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kimpropoulos, for your very detailed and intelligent approach. I'd like to address a question to Mr. Hallstrom, since he is the president of the Human Rights Foundation. What happens in cases when we see a perceived injustice or a major crime being committed, and somehow we punish the wrong person, and that person being wrongly punished of violating their human right? Has this been considered at all?
You're asking me about the problems with regard to judging and convicting the wrong person. Well, ideally in democracies, there are mechanisms to redress this. There are appeals. There is a free media. There's the possibility of having a campaign to free someone from prison. One sees this happening on a regular basis. These mechanisms exist. An injustice of false conviction is a terrible, terrible thing. And I do think that there's a fundamental difference between states that have rule of law and where these mechanisms exist versus states that don't have these mechanisms and where there is no concern for due process. The fight for impunity must, as a cornerstone, have an understanding and respect for rule of law. Everyone, no matter how loathsome, no matter how terrible the crimes that they are accused of, deserves all sorts of due process that includes the right to a fair trial, the right to review the evidence against them, the right to confront and question witnesses, the right to know the charges that are filed against them, and a mechanism for appeal for whether it's a trial by judge or a trial by jury, something that is going to be fair and impartial. I should add, none of this exists in places like China, Russia, North Korea, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. None of this exists. So although the system may not be perfect in democracies and injustices are committed and they are stained on the system, that is infinitely better than a state where none of these protections exist.
Thank you very much. A very enlightening reply. Is there anything else anybody would like to add? Mrs. Rickstrom, for example, what would you say about the possibility of encouraging whistleblowers in the EU to come out with revelations of serious wrongdoing?
It is unfortunately a lot of talk only, no action. We would like to see this implemented in a much more coherent way. I know that there are some member states taking the lead, but the EU as such could do so much more.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Voridis, I believe, has already left us. He had a prior engagement. Anybody else want to add anything? I think we've covered the subject specifically. I still have a few doubts about how the practicalities of the drive against impunity can be carried out. But what's encouraging is that the issue is being addressed in a webinar like this one, and certain problems are being revealed, are being out. Anybody else want to add anything?
Well, I'd like to add, if I may, Professor, I'd like to add a couple of things. Since the Second World War and the crimes committed by the political party that had hijacked Germany's democracy and turned it into a dictatorship, there was a body of law created with regard to impunity that communicated very, very aggressively that if you commit a human rights violation and you cannot claim that you are just following orders, at the same time, if you are not actually carrying it out and you are giving the orders, that also means that you are you can be prosecuted. And we find that if we can communicate that reality to the policemen, the chiefs of police, the people, the torturers, the people in the middle ranks of these places where human rights violations occur, it may actually stop some of them from doing the jobs that they are being tasked to do. And what that requires is reaching out to them directly, identifying them, telling the people who are carrying the repression out in Cuba, even if you're following orders, we have identified you. We know who you are. And when the day comes, we will have you prosecuted. We find, and of course, as a non-governmental institution, we can absolutely carry that out and essentially begin to identify who is carrying out these crimes and letting them know. And our view is even if only 10% of them decide not to do such a thing, decide to back off and not to engage in what their authoritarian masters tell them, we think that this can actually be transformational and could even bring about, in the moment of truth, a change when those with the weapons decide not to use them against the people and instead do not participate with what their masters say. So I'd like to add that. And as for the question, the very important question about the whistleblowers, dealing with the whistleblowers is simple. To incentivize them, we need to pass legislation that says that if you blow the whistle on someone who has stolen money from one of these places, one of these human rights violators, and if we seize those funds, you are going to get a percentage of them. If that were the case, well, one, Switzerland would be mostly out of business, as would banking institutions, some of them in the Middle East, in Singapore, and so on and so forth. Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, places that are very respectable, but yet is the place where all of this money is sitting. So we think if we can incentivize it through law, some good can come of that.
Mr. Carr, can I add up something?
Yes, by all means. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think that it is slightly an extension about what Mr. Halvorsen said. And I think that Mrs. Rickstrom is going to totally understand that many of our citizens asks and request why you don't make powerful sanctions when a third country and another country create violation towards the human rights. And I think that we need to give an answer on this, because we must be very careful about the way we use sanctions. Our sanctions should be smart and targeted at the persons or groups violating human rights and adjusted depending on the target's behavior. Therefore, we need to strike a delicate balance between having effective sanctions, which makes the target comply, but at the same time, to as much as possible, limit the negative sequences on the rest of the population. And the population should not suffer for a few despots and authoritarian leaders. And these actions should not impact the enjoyment of human rights by the population. At the same time, we need to safeguard that they have a sound legal basis. So I think that we need to know this balance, and we need to support this balance. Therefore, we cannot use a lot of sanctions against people because it's going to be against them, not in favor.
May I respond to that briefly, Mr. Carr? So I agree precisely, which is why we should engage in targeted sanctions. So if you are a general or the chief of police or the minister of justice who is putting the journalists in jail, who is engaging in this conduct, you should have targeted sanctions. Neither you nor your family nor your children can come and go to a university in France or in Spain. You can't buy apartments. You can't go to Euro Disney. You can't go to Disney World. You cannot vacation on the French Riviera. You cannot have a house in Monaco. And we limit them so that they can only enjoy their ill-gotten wealth in their own countries. That is targeted sanctions, and it bothers them so much, which is why when the Magnitsky Law was passed in the United States, it was so vitally important for Putin to have it eliminated, which is why all of the scandal involving the private meetings at the Trump Tower, in which the only thing they discussed was eliminating the Magnitsky sanctions. We know the sanctions work. We know the targeted sanctions work, whether it's against the government in Hong Kong or the government in Russia. And we should continue to use this mechanism. And I encourage those who are watching to encourage their own governments to adopt a version of the Magnitsky Law. Let's make the Magnitsky Law the international mechanism for this worldwide.
Can I interfere? I'd like to thank you, Thor, for having pointed this out. I think it's an excellent way to actually do what is needed at this point. Something that is similar that came into my mind is actually these golden visas that certain countries are still pursuing, even though it is strictly recommended by the EU. It has not become a legislation yet, I believe. But the golden visa is really an issue, whereas Cyprus, Malta, even Greece, God forbid, is doing or has been doing that until just recently. For the moment, I really don't know the situation. But Thor, maybe you know more about this, because golden visa is something absolutely critical at this moment, whereas we know that some of the oligarchs, some of the dictators are just buying property in central of Athens with millions of euros, and they never set foot there. They just want the golden visa to go and pursue their activities all over the European Union. And this is something that needs to be abolished rather yesterday than tomorrow.
I agree completely, Ms. Rickstrom. Whether it's golden visa, business visa, or exemptions to the Magnitsky Law. When the Magnitsky Law was passed, the Russian government asked, can we just have a blanket 10,000 visas that are not subject to Magnitsky, where we can move anyone into this? And no, the answer is no. And consider the other element. A lot of local government officials want the property rights. I'm sorry, not the property. They want property purchases because it makes the real estate value goes up. But yes, what if you can seize it and then the local government can take it and then sell it? So, I mean, my view that one of the best things of fighting against those who do evil, those who behave in evil ways, is let's take their money and let's have the money go to basically fix some of the problems they've created. Why should they get away with it? You want to fight impunity? Let's start by taking their money.
Exactly. And what you're pointing out is a Swedish proverb saying this is one of the few occasions where you can both eat the cake and save it. So that's what government can actually do. As soon as they realize they can enact it, but there is a lot to wish for, unfortunately.
Well, Ms. Rickstrom, so we can wind up this session, I have one final point to make. I noticed that in your earlier contribution, you mentioned the media. Now, we all know that the media in democratic and non-democratic countries have an agenda. They have a narrative. How do you feel that the media in most democratic countries handles a narrative of major impunity?
Couldn't get the content of your question.
Oh, shall I repeat it? Did you hear it?
I'll mute my microphone. Maybe we should all mute our microphones to see if it's better.
Oh, no, I'll repeat it. You mentioned the media several times in your previous little speech. Now, we all know the media have an agenda. They have a narrative which they put forward, whether it's a democratic country or non-democratic country, especially in the democratic world, Western world. How do you feel the media has handled issues of major wrongdoing and impunity?
Always a crucial role also on this issue, but what I wanted to point out and make sure is that when media is politicized and the narrative is more or less drawn up by a government, media freedom is deteriorating and media cannot execute their duties. Journalists cannot work as they should, and so the same thing happened. We have seen it in Hungary, where it started with changing the constitutional law, going to politicize judiciaries, and the third thing is to go to the media, attack the media so that media freedom is not safeguarded anymore. And after that, the following step is of course to abolish journalistic freedom also. It happened exactly like a school book, like a manual in Hungary. It's best to copy that. I mean, even a director for the National Theatre or conductor is being persecuted, is being harassed, is being fired, and replaced with government okay individuals, and this is happening like a manual in country after country. And when this is happening in the European Union, we should all act here before we start pointing out other countries. That's my view anyway.
Okay, that's a very good point, Ms. Rickstrom. I think we're close to the end of our session now. We'll take a short break, after which the Greek section of the conference will proceed under the direction of my esteemed colleague, Ioana Mandru, who I understand is an expert on the legal aspects of this whole case, especially when Mr. Kypriopoulos mentioned we need a sound legal basis for whatever should be done. And I think that has come out, what has come out of this short webinar. Anyway, we'll break for